Growing up in a small suburban neighborhood, my childhood was uneventful for the most part. The kind of neighborhood where kids biked in the cul-de-sac and parents waved to each other from driveways. My best friend Jamie and I spent countless hours at our local park. It wasn't anything special, just a few swings, a rusted merry-go-round, and an old metal slide that burned your legs in the summer. But to us, it was magical. The slide was always our favorite spot. There was something timeless about climbing those metal steps, feeling the heat of the sun on your palms, and flying down as fast as you could. The slide stood on a wooden platform, beneath which was a hollow space surrounded by loose wood chips. We called it the fort. It was where we imagined secret worlds, hid from imaginary monsters, and swapped treasures like buttons and bottle caps. One summer evening, as the golden hour painted the sky, Jamie and I sat cross-legged in the fort, comparing the haul we'd found in the nearby woods. Jamie had an old pocket watch, its hands frozen at 3:17. I'd found a smooth black rock that looked like a tiny egg. While we were swapping stories about where our treasures might have come from, Jamie froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice low and tight. I shook my head, but his wide eyes unnerved me. I strained my ears and caught it, a faint shuffling sound, like dry leaves being moved around, coming from just beyond the playground's edge where the woods began. My first instinct was to brush it off, probably a squirrel or a bird. But Jamie wasn't convinced. "There's someone out there," he hissed. His voice was urgent now, and it planted a seed of doubt in my mind. We crept out of the fort and squinted toward the tree line. The fading light made the woods look darker than they should have been. At first, we didn't see anything. Then, a movement, a figure, just barely visible, slipped behind a tree. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, spindly limbs. My chest tightened. "Maybe it's Mr. Lyles," I whispered, referencing the old man who lived alone a few streets over and often walked the woods collecting firewood. Jamie shook his head violently. "That's not him." We didn't wait to confirm. Scrambling out of the playground, we bolted down the street toward home. The figure didn't follow, but I felt eyes on us the entire way. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image of that tall, shadowy figure. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a tree branch moving in the wind. But Jamie called me the next day, his voice shaky. "I went back," he confessed. "What? Why?" My stomach dropped. I needed to know what it was. And Jamie was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "There's a door under the slide." "What are you talking about?" I demanded. "I swear, it wasn't there before," Jamie said. "It's small, like for a crawl space. It was open when I got there." My mind raced. The slide, as far as I knew, had always been just that, a slide. There wasn't any door, no hidden compartments. But Jamie's voice carried an edge of desperation that made me believe him. After a lot of back and forth, I agreed to meet him at the park later that day. My parents were at work, and I didn't bother telling them where I was going. They wouldn't have cared. It was summer, and they assumed I was with Jamie anyway. When I arrived at the park, Jamie was already waiting, pacing nervously near the slide. The playground was eerily empty. No kids, no parents, just the sound of cicadas buzzing in the distance. "Look," Jamie urged, pulling me toward the fort. He wasn't lying. Beneath the slide, where the wooden platform met the ground, was a small square door. It looked old, metal, with rust creeping along its edges. It was slightly ajar, revealing blackness beyond. "See?" Jamie whispered. I wasn't making it up. I wanted to tell him to leave it alone, to go home and forget about it. But there was something about that door, an irresistible pull that made my curiosity outweigh my fear. I crouched down and tugged it open wider. A rush of cool, damp air hit my face. "Don't," Jamie hissed, but it was too late. Inside, the space was far deeper than it should have been. It wasn't just a hollow. It was a tunnel, sloping downward into darkness. The wood chips beneath the slide stopped abruptly at the edge of the door, replaced by dirt and jagged rocks. I could hear faint whispers, almost like wind, but the air outside was still. "Let's go," Jamie urged, tugging at my sleeve. But I couldn't. I leaned closer, squinting into the shadows. That's when I saw it, a hand, pale and bony, resting on the dirt floor just inside the tunnel. It wasn't moving, but I knew it wasn't a trick of the light. My stomach churned, and I scrambled back. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Jamie's arm. We tore out of the park and didn't stop until we were back at my house. Neither of us spoke about what we saw for weeks, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The door, the hand, the impossible darkness. Months later, the park was renovated. The slide was replaced with a modern plastic one, and the old wooden platform was torn down. I biked by during the construction and noticed the workers hauling away what looked like a large, rusted door. Jamie moved away the following year, and we lost touch. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I dream about that tunnel and the whispers that floated up from the dark, and I wonder if, somewhere beneath the surface, that pale hand is still waiting. When I was a kid, there was a patch of forest near my house that we called the thicket. It wasn't huge, but it felt endless to us. Tall trees with twisted roots, hidden clearings, and overgrown trails that seemed to lead nowhere. My parents warned me never to go in too far, but like most kids, I didn't listen. The thicket was where all the best adventures happened. One summer, my best friend Matt and I stumbled across something we'd never seen before. A rope swing hanging from the tallest tree in a small clearing. It was a simple thing, just a thick rope with a wooden seat tied at the bottom, but it looked old, like it had been there for years. The strange part was, we'd been to that clearing dozens of times before, and the swing hadn't been there. "Maybe someone just put it up," Matt said, though he didn't sound convinced. We took turns trying it out. The rope held firm, and the swing gave a satisfying arc, high enough to make your stomach flip. It was exhilarating, the kind of thrill that felt just a little dangerous. By the time we were done, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. I glanced back at the swing as we left and felt an odd pang, like it was watching us leave. The next day, we went back to the swing. It was still there, swaying gently in the breeze, though the air was completely still around us. Matt noticed it first. "There's no wind," he said, his voice hushed. I shrugged it off. Probably just, I don't know, momentum or something. Neither of us sounded convinced, but we took turns on it anyway. Something about the swing felt different this time. The rope was rougher, the seat colder, like it had been sitting in the rain even though the sky was clear. After a few minutes, Matt jumped off mid-swing, brushing his hands on his shorts. "Did you feel that?" he asked. "Feel what?" He shook his head. "Never mind." I tried not to let his unease bother me, but the way he kept glancing over his shoulder on the walk home made it hard to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, I dreamt of the swing. In the dream, it was swinging on its own, the seat twisting and turning like it was being pulled in different directions. A voice whispered my name, soft and distant, over and over until I woke up, my heart pounding. The next day, I told Matt about the dream. He didn't laugh like I expected. Instead, he told me he'd had a similar dream, except in his, the swing had a figure sitting on it, a child, with their back turned. "Maybe we shouldn't go back," he said, but of course we did. We returned to the swing in the late afternoon, the sun barely cutting through the thick canopy above. The clearing felt colder than the rest of the forest, and the swing moved slowly, as if someone had just gotten off it. "I don't like this," Matt muttered, but I ignored him. I walked up to the swing, running my fingers along the frayed rope. It felt damp, though there hadn't been any rain. When I touched the seat, a shiver ran down my spine. It was ice cold. "Let's just go," Matt said, pulling at my arm. "Wait," I said, staring at the ground beneath the swing. The dirt was disturbed, like someone had been digging. A faint, circular impression was visible, as if something heavy had been buried there. "What is that?" Matt asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed a nearby stick and began poking at the dirt. Matt protested, but he didn't stop me. As I dug, the dirt gave way easily, revealing something smooth and white beneath the surface. A bone. I dropped the stick and stumbled back, my stomach twisting in knots. Matt stared, his face pale. "What the hell, man?" he stammered. Before I could respond, the swing creaked loudly. We both froze as it began to sway violently, as if someone was pushing it. The air grew heavy, and a low, guttural sound filled the clearing. A voice, deep and broken, whispering words we couldn't understand. "Run," Matt said, his voice shaking, but neither of us could move. The swing stopped abruptly, and the voice fell silent. Then, from the edge of the clearing, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a child, no older than us, wearing tattered clothes and no shoes. Their face was pale and hollow, their eyes dark pits that seemed to pull the light out of the clearing. They pointed at us with a bony finger, their mouth opening wide but making no sound. That broke the spell. Matt and I bolted, running faster than we ever had in our lives. The sound of footsteps followed us, heavy and fast. But when we reached the edge of the forest and looked back, there was nothing there. We never went back to the swing after that. I tried to convince myself it was just our imaginations, that the bone was probably an animal's and the figure was a trick of the light. But Matt wouldn't talk about it, and the way he avoided the woods entirely told me he didn't believe that either. Years later, the woods were cleared to make way for new housing developments. I went back once, out of curiosity, to see the construction site. The clearing was gone, replaced by rows of half-built houses. But as I walked through the area, I swore I could hear the faint creak of a swing in the distance. And for just a moment, I thought I saw the child again, standing between the trees that hadn't yet been cut down, watching me with those empty eyes. If you like these stories, please support us by liking and subscribing. It helps me find more creepy stories for you. When I was 10, my family moved into an old house on the outskirts of a sleepy town in Pennsylvania. It was one of those tall, narrow homes with creaky wooden floors and a porch that seemed to sag under its own weight. The house came with a peculiar feature: a room on the second floor with a heavy, padlocked door. My parents told me it was a storage room. They said the lock was there to keep me and my little sister, Emma, out of it. At first, I accepted that explanation, but as the weeks passed, I couldn't help but notice little things about that room that didn't add up. For one, the padlock was ancient and rusted, as though it hadn't been touched in years. If it was just storage, why not use a regular lock? And then there were the sounds, soft thumps and faint rustling noises that I sometimes heard late at night, as though someone, or something, was moving around in there. Emma and I used to sit on the hallway floor outside the door, daring each other to knock on it. I always chickened out, but Emma was braver. One afternoon, she gave it 3 sharp raps and pressed her ear against the wood. "Well?" I asked, holding my breath. She pulled back, her face pale. Something knocked back. Our curiosity only grew. One Saturday, while our parents were running errands, we decided to investigate. Emma was the mastermind. She'd swiped the spare key ring from the kitchen drawer, but none of the keys fit the padlock, and she was frustrated. "We'll figure it out later," she said, but I could tell her mind was already working on a plan. That night, I woke to a strange sound, like someone dragging a sack across the floor. It was coming from the locked room. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and stared at my door, half expecting it to swing open. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started, and the house fell silent. I lay awake until the first rays of sunlight crept through my window, wondering if I'd imagined it. The next morning, Emma revealed her latest idea. "Let's take the hinges off." "You're crazy," I said, but the truth was, I wanted to know what was behind that door as much as she did. We waited until the afternoon, when Dad was in the garage and Mom was on the phone. Emma had found a screwdriver in Dad's toolbox, and she handed it to me with an expectant look. I hesitated, but her determination pushed me forward. It was harder than I thought. The screws were rusted, and the door itself was heavy. But eventually, the last hinge came free, and Emma and I stood there, staring at the slightly ajar door. "Go ahead," she whispered. I pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind us. At first, I couldn't see much, just piles of old furniture covered in dusty sheets. But then my eyes landed on something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner, a small chair faced the wall. On it sat a doll, its porcelain face cracked and pale, its glassy eyes fixed on us. I wanted to run, but Emma stepped inside before I could stop her. "Wait," I hissed, grabbing her arm. But she shook me off, her gaze fixed on the doll. She approached it slowly, as if drawn by some invisible force. "It's just a doll," she said, her voice shaky. But I could tell she didn't believe her own words. As she reached out to touch it, the door slammed shut behind us. We both screamed, and I lunged for the handle, yanking it with all my strength. It wouldn't budge. "Open it," Emma shrieked, her voice rising to a pitch I'd never heard before. I fumbled for the hinges, but the door was too heavy to lift without the screws in place. We were trapped, and then the whispering started. It was faint at first, like a breeze rustling through leaves, but it grew louder, filling the room with a low, guttural murmur. The doll's head turned slowly, its eyes locking onto mine. I froze, my mind racing with disbelief and terror. Emma screamed again, snapping me out of my stupor. I grabbed the doll and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a sickening crack, its head shattering into pieces. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the room was deathly silent. Then, the door creaked open on its own. We didn't wait to question it. Grabbing Emma's hand, I bolted out of the room and down the stairs. We burst into the living room, where our parents looked up, startled. "What's wrong?" Mom asked, but we were too out of breath to answer. That night, I lay awake, my heart still racing. I couldn't shake the image of that doll or the whispers that had surrounded us. Emma refused to talk about it, and for once, I didn't press her. A week later, a moving truck pulled up to our house. I watched from the porch as two men carried out the furniture from the locked room. When they emerged with the small chair, I felt a chill run down my spine. The doll wasn't on it. "Where's the doll?" I asked one of the movers, my voice barely audible. He gave me a puzzled look. "What doll?" The room was empty when we got here. I didn't say anything, but I knew he was wrong. The doll wasn't gone. It had never left. I started avoiding the upstairs entirely, and Emma began sleeping in my room. Even now, years later, I can't look at a porcelain doll without feeling that creeping unease. I sometimes dream about that room and the whispers that filled it. And in those dreams, the doll always finds its way back to me. When I was 9, my family moved into a big, old house that looked like it belonged in a black and white horror movie. My mom called it a fixer-upper, which, as far as I could tell, just meant it needed a ton of work. The house had peeling wallpaper, creaky floors, and a backyard overrun with weeds. But to me, the most unsettling part was the window in my bedroom. It wasn't an ordinary window. It was small and circular, positioned high up on the wall opposite my bed. My dad called it a decorative feature, but I didn't see the point of a window you couldn't look out of. At night, I'd lie in bed and stare at it, half expecting to see something looking back. For the first few weeks, nothing happened. I got used to the groaning floorboards and the occasional draft that made the curtains sway. My older brother, Danny, loved to tease me about the window, saying it was where the man in the wall watched me sleep. I hated him for that. One night, I woke up to the sound of tapping. It was soft and rhythmic, like someone gently knocking on glass. At first, I thought it was rain, but when I sat up and looked, the sky outside was clear. The tapping came again, and my eyes darted to the small window. A shadow moved behind it. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The shadow was faint, but unmistakable, a dark figure shifting just beyond the glass. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, maybe a bird or a tree branch, but there were no trees near that side of the house. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I scrambled out of bed and ran to Danny's room. He was half asleep when I burst in, shaking his shoulder. "What?" he mumbled, annoyed. "There's someone at my window," I whispered, tears threatening to spill over. Danny groaned and rolled over. "It's probably just the wind. Go back to sleep." I begged him to come look, but he waved me off. Frustrated and scared, I spent the rest of the night huddled under my blankets, the tapping echoing in my ears until it finally stopped. The next morning, I told my parents. My dad checked the window but found nothing unusual. "See? It's just your imagination," he said, ruffling my hair. But I knew what I'd seen, or at least what I thought I'd seen. For the next few nights, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. But every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the window looming above me, its empty gaze boring into my back. And then, one night, the shadow returned. This time, it didn't tap. It stayed still, a dark, blurry outline that seemed to grow more defined the longer I stared at it. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. It felt like my body was glued to the bed, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. The shadow tilted its head, as if studying me. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, the window was empty again. The only evidence that anything had happened was the faint smudge of a handprint on the inside of the glass. I didn't tell anyone about the handprint. I wasn't sure they'd believe me, and honestly, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But that morning, something changed. The atmosphere in my room felt heavier, like the air was thicker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Danny noticed my unease and, in his typical big brother fashion, decided to make things worse. "Maybe the man in the wall wants a new friend," he teased, wiggling his fingers like claws. "You should leave him a note." "Shut up, Danny," I snapped, storming off. But his words planted a seed in my mind. That night, after my parents went to bed, I climbed onto my desk chair and reached up to the window. I'd brought a flashlight and a marker with me. My hand shook as I wrote 2 words on the glass. "Who are you?" I felt ridiculous as I climbed back down. It was just a window, I told myself. Nothing was going to happen. But deep down, I hoped, no, I feared. I was wrong. At some point in the night, I woke up again. The flashlight I'd left on my desk flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. I glanced at the window, and my blood turned to ice. The words I'd written were still there, but below them, in jagged, uneven letters, was a single reply. "Come closer." I didn't scream. I couldn't. The fear was too overwhelming, paralyzing me as I stared at those 2 words. The shadow was back, pressed against the glass, its head tilted in that same unnerving way. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the window. Time seemed to stretch, the room growing colder with every passing second. Finally, the shadow moved. It raised a hand again and began to write on the glass, the letters forming in frost. "Let me in." I bolted out of the room and didn't stop until I was in my parents' bed. My mom groggily asked what was wrong, but I couldn't find the words to explain. She let me stay, probably assuming I'd had a nightmare. The next day, I refused to go back into my room. My dad, annoyed, went in to prove there was nothing wrong. When he came out, he looked pale. "Did you write something on the window?" he asked, holding up a rag. I nodded, hesitant. "Well, it's gone now," he said, his voice tight. "Let's leave it at that." I never slept in that room again. My parents eventually moved my bed to the guest room, and the old room became a glorified storage space. The window was sealed up during a renovation a few years later, but I still think about it sometimes. Sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up and swear I hear tapping on the walls. I tell myself it's nothing, but in the quiet moments before sleep, I can't help but wonder, did I let something in? When I was 8, my family moved into a 2-story house with an attic that no one ever went into. My mom said it was too small to be useful, and my dad claimed it was infested with spiders. I didn't care much at first. I was more excited about the big backyard and the tree I could climb. But there was one thing about the house that unsettled me. The mirror in my bedroom. It wasn't just any mirror. It was an antique, oval-shaped with an ornate bronze frame. My mom said it came with the house and thought it added character. I hated it. There was something off about the way it reflected light, the way it seemed to hold onto your image a second longer than it should. But my parents wouldn't let me take it down. "It's just a mirror," my dad said with a shrug. Don't be dramatic." I tried to ignore it, but every night, as I lay in bed, I felt its presence. Even with my back turned, I could feel it, like a pair of eyes watching me. One night, I woke up thirsty and shuffled downstairs for a glass of water. As I passed by the mirror, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. I stopped and stared at the reflection, but there was nothing there. Just me, groggy and half asleep. Shaking it off, I grabbed my water and went back to bed. But as I climbed under the covers, I noticed something strange. The reflection of my bed in the mirror was empty. My breath caught in my throat. I turned around to look at the real bed and saw myself lying there, just as I should be. When I turned back to the mirror, my reflection was back too, as though nothing had happened. I convinced myself I was imagining things. I was tired, and my mind was playing tricks on me. That's what I told myself, anyway. The next night, it happened again. This time, I saw movement in the mirror, even though I was lying perfectly still. My reflection blinked, tilted its head, and smiled. A slow, eerie smile that didn't match my face at all. I screamed, scrambling out of bed and running to my parents' room. My dad groggily followed me back to my room, flipping on the light. "See? Nothing's wrong," he said, gesturing to the mirror. My reflection stared back, normal as ever. It smiled at me. I insisted, tears streaming down my face. My dad sighed. "It's late. Go to sleep." I spent the rest of the night with the covers pulled over my head, too afraid to look at the mirror again. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences escalated. I started seeing things in the mirror that didn't belong there. Shadows darting behind me, faint shapes that disappeared when I turned around. My reflection began to act more erratically, moving when I didn't, its expressions growing more sinister. One afternoon, while my mom was out grocery shopping, I decided I'd had enough. I dragged a blanket over the mirror and taped it in place, breathing a sigh of relief when I could no longer see its surface. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. That night, I slept soundly, until a loud thud jolted me awake. My heart raced as I fumbled for the light switch. When I turned it on, I saw the blanket crumpled on the floor. The mirror was uncovered, and my reflection was staring at me, smiling that same awful smile. It raised a hand, but I didn't move. I watched, paralyzed, as it pressed its hand against the glass and began to whisper. I couldn't hear the words, but I could feel them, crawling into my ears like insects. My head spun, and I blacked out. When I woke up, it was morning, and the mirror looked normal again. I wanted to tell my parents, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. Instead, I avoided my room as much as possible, spending most of my time outside or in the living room. But at night, I had no choice but to return. One evening, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft tapping sound. I froze, my eyes darting to the mirror. My reflection was there, but it wasn't alone. Behind it stood a dark figure, its face obscured but its eyes burning with a cold, white light. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as the figure reached out toward me through the glass. My reflection mimicked the movement, its fingers pressing against the inside of the mirror as though it was trying to push its way through. I screamed, and the lights in my room flickered violently. My parents burst in moments later, but by then, the mirror was empty again. My dad was furious, blaming the old wiring for the flickering, but my mom was quieter, her eyes lingering on the mirror. The next day, a repairman came to the house to check the electrical system. I overheard him talking to my mom in hushed tones, mentioning something about the attic. Later, I snuck up there myself, my curiosity outweighing my fear. The attic was dark and cluttered, filled with old boxes and furniture. But in the corner, I found something that made my blood run cold. A broken mirror, identical to the one in my room, its frame cracked and its surface covered in black smudges. A faint, whispering sound emanated from it, growing louder the closer I got. I ran downstairs and begged my parents to get rid of the mirror in my room. My mom finally relented, taking it down and putting it in the garage. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully, but the peace didn't last. A few days later, I found the mirror back in my room, leaning against the wall. My mom swore she hadn't moved it, and my dad insisted he hadn't touched it either. I don't live in that house anymore, but I still dream about that mirror. Sometimes, I wake up to find my reflection watching me, even though there's no mirror in my bedroom now. It's always smiling,